In the spirit of the Tholos Circle, where ancient thinkers gather to debate the issues of today, this is Tholos Talks. Through deep insight and thought-provoking dialogue, we offer the tools to decode complexity and illuminate the path forward.
Welcome to Coffee, Trade, and Tech. I'm Jake Jennings, Chair of Basilinna, America's Trade and Tech Practice. Today, we're joined by John Neuffer, President and CEO of the Semiconductor Industry Association. John has been at the helm of SIA since 2015, bringing over 2 decades of experience in technology policy, trade, and global affairs to the organization. Prior to joining SIA, he served as Senior Vice President for Global Policy at the Information Technology Industry Council and held key positions at the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative, including Deputy Assistant U.S. Trade Representative for Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation Affairs and Japan. John, it's great to have you here. Let's start with your background and journey to becoming the head of SIA. You've been at the intersection of trade, technology, and public policy for years. Given the increasing strategic importance of semiconductors, what drew you to this sector, and how have you seen its role evolve? Basically, when did you decide that you were going to grow up, become a global public policy expert?
Thanks, Jake. Great to be here. Wow, it didn't actually happen like that. It was a slow evolution. But I'll say I'd spent nearly a decade in Japan working at a think tank there, wanted to come back and do government service, worked at USTR for a number of years, loved it there. And that's when I started getting involved in tech policy and trade, began to work with some of the semiconductor companies then. Went to ITI, did a little bit more work, and then came over to here at SIA nearly 10 years ago. And when I took this job 10 years ago, honestly, afraid it was going to be a little too sleepy.
Too sleepy?
Yes. And it didn't turn out that way. China became a very big challenge, made the policy landscape very interesting. Then the pandemic, the chip shortages, and it's just been a roller coaster ride since then. A very interesting one, though.
On that point, what role do you see semiconductors playing in the global economy?
First of all, a couple of data points. We are now more than a $600 billion industry. In fact, by some estimates, we're going to be a $1 trillion industry by 2030, 5 years from now. Our growth rate last year as an industry was north of 20% year over year. This year, it's projected to be north of 10%. Now,
Yes, with all the technology restrictions in place.
Exactly. It really comes down to the proliferation of chips in just about everything. For sure, AI chips drove a lot of the growth, but in the industry overall has a very promising future. We're in computers, we're in toasters, we're in ovens and refrigerators, hearing aids, pacemakers. So the U.S. itself has controlled about half of the global market for decades, and we're on track to do that for the foreseeable future. When you're looking at the technology itself, it's only been around for about 60 or 70 years, chips. Now, the most sophisticated processors, the most powerful processors have over 1 billion transistors on them, a chip with 1 billion transistors on it. And that's because we have learned how to manipulate materials at the molecular level to make transistors. So it's really, for me, it's like magic. It's like science fiction. For me, I'm not a STEM kind of guy, policy guy, but it's really grown into be an awesome technology.
I know one of the things everybody focuses on is Moore's Law, something to the effect of every year, the number of semiconductors you can fit on a chip doubles. Are you still seeing that play out?
So Moore's Law has become more and more challenging, pun intended, to race after. It's costing a lot more money to chase Moore's Law, and we are facing some physics challenges. But that doesn't mean that the pace of innovation will necessarily slow down. There's architecture, there's design, there's materials, there's lots of innovative headroom in other areas, in addition to chasing the smallest transistors. So we're not done chasing Moore's Law, but there's a ton of other things that we're doing to make our chips kind of breathtakingly innovative.
So you mentioned both economics and physics. Does public policy play a role in the semiconductor industry?
So let me answer that from a high level first. Two of the biggest reasons that we've been such a successful industry. One, we invest about $1 in $5 we get in revenue back into R&D. We are the second most R&D intensive industry in the world after pharmaceuticals. All those R&D dollars help us chase things like Moore's Law and help us to be amazingly innovative. So that's one side of it. The other side of it is we've become incredibly dependent and built out incredibly sophisticated global supply chain, which has allowed us to be amazingly efficient, cost effective, and innovative. You asked about policy. Two areas of policy that need to be right for us to continue to succeed are policies that help promote R&D, and that involves government, which plays a role in R&D, and policies that help build out and keep our supply chains thriving.
It seems that, in the previous administration, there was a lot of focus on nearshoring. The Trump administration has kind of pushed that to really focus on America first and onshoring, going as far as in some documents that economic policy or economic security is national security. Has that kind of, fine-tuning changed your members' investment all the way from the CHIPS Act on incentives to, how do you attract talent? What's been the impact of that pivot?
Let me just say a couple of things. First of all, reshoring in our industry doesn't really happen. Just to get some of the nomenclature right here. It's just because when you build a $10 billion fab somewhere, you're not going to move that fabrication facility. That's where the chips are made. So a lot of people use the reshoring. You didn't actually, but a lot of people use that terminology, but it doesn't really work for our industry. So onshoring is correct. The real kind of discussion is, where are all the new fabs going to be built, right? Are they going to be built on U.S. shores? Are they going to be built overseas? For decades, U.S. government was not in the business of providing incentives to incentivize manufacturing in the U.S. Other governments were heavily involved in that. And so there were huge incentive packages to build fabs overseas. In fact, we had Boston Consulting Group do a study for us a few years ago, and it turns out the number one factor when leadership on our industry was looking at when it was thinking about where to put the next fab was the most important factor. That, IP protection, very important, rule of law, very important, workforce, very important. But the one with the biggest impact was the incentives, because other governments offered such huge incentives. Well, that meant that in 1990, Trump administration understood that and got the CHIPS Act going forward, which culminated in a law signing in 2022 that finally got the U.S. government in the business of incentivizing manufacturing and leveling the playing field. As a result of that, our industry has committed more than $500 million in investments here in the U.S. Now, a lot of that fabs are already going up or in the process of going up. And it really kind of turned the corner for us. America now is an attractive place for manufacturing semiconductors.
Looking forward, it seems the Trump administration kind of also wants to curtail, and maybe I've heard, for the term revoking the CHIPS Act that the Biden administration put out. Is that even feasible? I mean, hasn't some of that money already gone out the door and been, pledged to industry?
Yeah. So listen, it's perfectly reasonable for the new team to look at the agreements that have been signed with the companies involving the grants. That's just part of the process. We expect that to happen. Well, we feel that incentives need to be in place and incentives need to stay in place in some form as we go forward. Because if you pull back, other governments are not going to pull back with their incentive programs, and it takes us back to square one.
So kind of along that, there seems to be this competition between U.S. technology and China. Both the Biden administration, actually, I take it all the way back to Trump 1. There were quite a few export controls that were placed on Chinese entities that carried over to additional, export controls at for under Biden. The Trump plan seems to be wanting to continue that. How do you see the U.S. China relationship playing out, given the intricacies of the supply chain you mentioned and the other issues that we face?
The China balancing act is a very difficult one, a very challenging one. For quite a while now, there's been focus in the Trump administration, the Biden administration, again, in the Trump administration, on limiting certain technologies from leaving our shores. With China, at the same time, China is still a very, very large market for our semiconductors. And if that market is seriously curtailed, that will pinch our ability to aggressively move forward with our R&D, which helps us pedal faster and stay in the pole position globally. So that is a very complicated story. Looking forward to is where things go when our president and the Chinese president kind of re-engage. And I expect there'll be a fair amount of kind of top-down directionality. And I think everyone's kind of waiting to see what happens there.
Is there also a concern on those kind of intricacies that some non-U.S. firms would look at the export controls as an opportunity to undercut it?
So we have a lot of great international companies in SI membership, but we call that backfilling. And this is something that we have taken to the U.S. government over and over again, is if you are going to put controls in place, please don't do it unilaterally. This has happened in the past, and what plays forward is the national security objective is not met because backfilling occurs on the one side, and U.S. industry is inadvertently harmed. How does that work out? Well, for anybody, really.
No, that's a great point, John. And then how do you see the U.S.-EU relationship playing out? Is that an opportunity or a risk in your members' mind?
So Europe is a very important part of our supply chains, and we're the strongest when it comes to chip design. We're getting stronger when it comes to manufacturing. Our semiconductor tool companies, these aren't hammers and nails. These are multi-million-dollar, sometimes $100 million tools that are used to make these sophisticated semiconductors. We're number one there as well. Koreans are very big on memory production. Taiwan on contract manufacturing. So Europe is very strong on what's known as analog chips. So we have the memory chips, we have the logic chips that are kind of the brains, and then there's the analog chips, which are not kind of as tech rich as the logic chips, but they're incredibly important. They're the ones that goes in our car tires, they go in the planes, they go in the avionics, they go into a lot of the weapon systems. U.S. passports, I don't know if they still do, but they used to have a chip from every single one of them have a chip from a European company in them. So Europe is very strong when it comes to the analog piece of this. Europe remaining viable and innovative for our sector is very important.
Are there other regions that don't necessarily make the headlines? I know Costa Rica has pretty good opportunity for a couple of your members. Are there Latin American countries that you guys are looking towards?
Yeah, it's just not Latin America. It's Costa Rica for sure. I was just down there last year. Costa Rica, Panama is making a play. Mexico, there's quite a lot of activity by our industry already in Mexico. But then if you go farther east, Southeast Asia is rich in our industry. The Philippines, Vietnam, Malaysia, Singapore are all very important links in our supply chain. A lot of so-called assembly test packaging, that's the back end, the last big process in semiconductor manufacturing that occurs. A lot of that happens in Southeast Asia. We really do have very sophisticated global supply chains where each kind of node, each link in the supply chain plays a very, very important role. And one thing we have said over and over again is a country can have an end-to-end supply chain on its own, but it would be extremely costly and extremely inefficient. And any country that did that would cripple itself in terms of being the most innovative.
Thanks. Kind of along those lines, like when you poll your members, what are the key issues that they're focused on and the adage on what's keeping them up at night?
Yeah, most immediately, we'd like to see continuity with CHIPS Act implementation. That's for sure. Another one is we have a big tax reform effort underway in Washington. There's aspects there that are important for us. We'd like to make sure that we get more breaks when it comes to our R&D investments. Workforce, huge issue, two sides of that. Immigration, we have forever imported a fair number of talent. A lot of STEM kids come to our universities, and we'd like those STEM kids to come and study at our great universities and then work for our companies. Doesn't really work that way. Most of them have to go home and work for the competition. That's one side of the workforce coin. The other one is training our own domestic talent here. And that's, our companies do a tremendous amount of work there, but the foundation of our workforce is on the basic science foundation. That's where we draw up most of our talent, and developing that foundation and keeping it strong. That's where government has a key role. Trade, worked at USTR. Trade is near and dear to me. There's a big push and justifiable push for us to be manufacturing more here in the US. Well, 70% of our customers are overseas. So if you want us to manufacture more here, don't you think government should be in the business of creating bigger markets overseas for our products? And that really hasn't been going on for quite a while now. Government has not been in the business of opening markets, market access for many years. And I know, Jake, we've talked about this a number of times with a lot of frustration. One thing about the Trump administration that looks very interesting in their trade agenda is taking a look at bilateral and sectoral trade agreements again, and seeing if there may be some positive things about that. And we would very much encourage that. Again, if you're going to incentivize or create an environment where you want more semiconductor manufacturing here on U.S. shores, 75% of our customers are overseas, 70% overseas, we need to be in the business of opening markets. The incentives very important, but the incentives themselves are not an overall strategy, right? So incentives are important. Building a strong workforce is another piece of the strategy. Helping to promote R&D investments here in the U.S. is another piece of the strategy. And then you got to have a trade strategy as well. They all got to fit together in a beautiful dance so that you can help this critical industry in the United States be the most innovative and keep the pole position.
It's interesting when you look at your sector, a lot of the value comes from the design and the IP, what we would typically call as services, not goods. I know in the past, the whole focus has been on trade balance of goods, not services. And in such, it's an easy answer to say, oh, well, if country X tariffs us at 25%, we should do the same. But my experience, more and more of the trade barriers companies face are regulatory or behind the barriers. I know USTR's got a number of reports that are due on April 1st, where they're going to look at these service issues, kind of an opportunity to compete, so to speak. Do you see that as a positive benefit and opportunity for your members? And the only other thing I'd note, John, is does USTR really need to wait and negotiate trade agreements, or do they have the tools at their disposal to address some of the more egregious trade barriers that your members may face abroad?
Yeah. First of all, interesting data point, for nearly 3 decades, U.S. has maintained consistent trade surplus in chips. Okay. So semiconductors have been a strong surplus for decades here in the U.S. When it comes to the kind of less tangible side of the business, as you say, the services side, big things for us are like strong IP protection, coherent regulatory system, adherence to the rule of law. So these are all very tough, so-called non-tariff barriers that are very, very difficult to get after. And then there's, of course, kind of the more obvious things. Some countries like to put tariffs on goods. And now there's a turn potentially to putting tariffs on electronics, cross-border data transfers, which to us would be, I wouldn't say catastrophic, but would be very, very bad, because all of our design stuff never sleeps. It goes from India, U.S., wherever, Europe. It passes from team to team. And for that to somehow get tariff put on it would be very bad for us. But it's things like, we have our CHIPS incentives. It's things like subsidies that are entirely funded by the government and decisions on what to build, not necessarily market driven. That kind of stuff is very hard to deal with. And, there was a time when the WTO was a place where you could do that, but can't really do that anymore.
I think we're a long way to go on WTO reform. That's probably a whole couple of episodes on one subject. So, John, as we wrap up, a couple of things. What should semiconductor companies, your members, suppliers, and customers be preparing for the next few years? And what opportunities do your members see?
Like I said in the beginning, I think the future is very bright for us, given how much our economies, how much our societies are depending on chips. I think that we're going to see a tendency for countries to try to attract more manufacturing. And I think in the U.S., that's going to continue. And I think our industry is very excited about the prospects of more onshoring chip manufacturing here. I think in the more immediate future, the current administration is looking to do things differently. And I do think we're just going to start seeing more tariffs, proliferation of tariffs. And I think we just all got to figure out how to deal with that the most effectively.
Thanks for that. And just curious, guilty pleasure, what are you reading and watching right now?
I'm watching you, Jake, right now. You mean on
the few hours you have off from SIA?
It's pretty standard stuff. White Lotus and Severance. I don't know if you're watching that one.
A little bit, yeah.
Yeah.
And I'll leave you with this one. Werner Vinge came out with his book, a number of years ago, coined the term singularity. How close do you think we are to the singularity?
I've loved the Terminator series. I think we're a long way from that, Jake, if that's where you're going. But it is a good question because it does compel us to take stock of where we are. And the iPhone turns 18 this year, right? It's hard
That's scary.
But it's hard to believe how much we've come to take it granted for what these little smartphones do for us. And, my children, they're in their early 20s and early 30s. That's pretty much everything they know. So, and then as I said, when transistors were first developed, there were a few on a piece of silicon. Now there's over 100 billion. So it's just kind of awesome how far we've come in really such a short period of time. And I think we got to be kind of awed by that and grateful for the benefits that derive from that.
I think that's a great point. We take so much for granted now. One of my favorite memes back when they landed on the moon, they did it with 16 or 32 kilobits of RAM. And now we've got, I've got a computer running, 64 megabits of RAM. And, the joke is, what are you doing with all that? Well, I've got 200 windows open on my computer.
From when this all began to now, we are literally carrying supercomputers in our pockets.
Any recommendations for those listening, John?
Stay tuned. Of course, AI will bring a lot of interesting things, but I think that the functionality that's going to be driven by these kind of awesome semiconductors is really kind of beyond our imagination if you go 10 years out.
Well, John, thank you for your insights today. It's clear there's much at stake for our industry as we navigate this new and emerging trade landscape. And I want to thank everybody for tuning in to the Basilinna podcast. This is Coffee, Tech, and Trade, the segment that unpacks the 21st century issues facing the global economy. John, thank you. Have a great day.
Jake, always good catching up. Thank you.
You too. Safe travels.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to Tholos Talks, a series by the Basilinna Institute, available on Spotify, YouTube, and SoundCloud. Make sure to follow and subscribe to our channels to stay up to date on upcoming episodes. To learn more about these topics or the work we're doing, visit the Basilinna website.